Now, there we go. And we are recording. So we always talk about why we're doing office hours. This is an important piece to consider as we're doing this. We know that assistive and instructional technologies are a high leverage practice as outlined by the Council for Exceptional Children. Those are those practices that when special education staff participate in them, they have the greatest impact on student learning. We also want to consider AT using the SET framework, and that's looking at the student, the environments, the tasks, and the tools. And we know that this is a great tool for equity to make sure that every student gets exactly what it is that they need. Today's guests, I am one of them, and I just introduced myself, but we also have Tina Olson here, so I will let her take a second and introduce herself too before we move into the slides.
Hello, I am the teacher for the physically impaired, and I work for the Northern Lights Special Ed Co-op, and I do a lot with the assistive technology group for the the regions, and then I just have a lot of networking with different assistive technology libraries that we can always get assistive technology if we want to do trials. So if you ever want to email me or have questions about trialing equipment or want equipment to trial, feel free to email me and I can get you in the right direction too.
Great, thanks, Tina. So we're going to be kind of alternating slides, going back and forth and talking about things and just chiming in as we go along. But here's our general agenda. We're going to talk about when we consider assistive technology, how we consider it, whose input do I get when I'm considering AT, how do I get that input, and then how do I document the AT consideration in the due process documents. So we're going to move through those. We'll move through them pretty quickly, but we'll want to make sure that we have lots of time at the end for questions and answers for your particular questions about considering AT.
So the first slide is, when do I consider AT? Now, one thing, it needs to be considered every year. It does not, even if you have an eval, I think sometimes we think it should only be done at an eval. That is a time you can consider it too, but it's nice to do it before the IEP. And then if you consider during the eval, you can have it as a separate part of the eval, or it can be a part of the eval. And we like to say consideration because an AT consideration is different than an AT evaluation. So you want to be careful with that. An AT evaluation is a longer process. It's more than the 30 days of school. So just something to think about. It's a consideration. And then sometimes on the eval, you can add assistive technology and then just do a little summary. So I said already, annually. And then just make sure that you are documenting a need in the evaluation so that you know why you came to that decision if you did want some type of assistive technology. And then this also helps for your district to show that you guys discussed it, you trialed it, and that it is going to work for the student, that they are willing to purchase it or look at MA. And that's it.
Great. And then looking at how we can consider assistive technology, this is in the slides are these links to many of the districts/co-ops throughout the region have different assistive technology consideration guides or forms. So there is the first one linked on there is the Duluth Public Schools AT consideration guide. We developed that a number of years ago through the MDE process. It's based on the SET framework. The Duluth Edison Charter Schools also have the AT consideration and trial process document with the guide linked in there. Northern Lights has their whole web page set up, and if you scroll down, you have the AT consideration guide here. Just keeping in mind that for many of these, this is the one from the Northland Learning Center. If you go to those links on the slide here, just know that you may have to request access because they may only be shared within their district or co-op. But I have never had anyone reject a request for sharing that information out, but you might be most interested in the ones within your district or co-op anyway. And if you're aware of any other ones that are being shared and used regionally, I'd love to hear about them so that I can share those out in the future as well.
And you may hear us talk about the SET framework. That is the one that we do typically use to help us guide us through that AT process. And it can look a little lengthy, but you don't have to address every area. Let's say you're looking at an LD student that he really just qualifies for reading comprehension. You know what class he's going to need maybe assistive technology in. So you can just discuss it, think about some apps that might help them, or some other technology, like a C-Pen reader. You can just throw out a bunch of ideas and then decide what you want to use for that trial. And then once you do the trial, you want to make sure you change that in the IEP or wherever you are started that process.
Beautiful.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask if you wanted to go ahead and talk about this one for a second.
This is just additional forms for the AT consideration. So just some more forms, the WIAT, sorry. And then the SET, and then there's a Region 10 Minnesota AT consideration manual. So just some more resources for you to use to get some more information. There's a wide variety out there.
Exactly. And like Tina was saying, like I wanted to put this as a title. This form looks overwhelming. Sometimes you get these like 2 or 3 page forms and it's like, whoa, what is this? And exactly as Tina said, like you might only be looking at one specific area. And the first bullet point there says, yes, it may be complex for some students who have complex needs. That's exactly when you might want to ask for help, whether that's from a coordinator, from me, I do work regionally, or whatever that might look like. There's probably someone who can help support you through that process. But many times when we're considering AT for students, you might only be looking at one specific area or a couple of areas. Maybe it's just reading and writing. And secondly, you don't need to have all the answers. That is a really important piece. The AT consideration process is to start you thinking about those pieces so that you can document it in the IEP moving forward, that you're going to be doing trials and looking for tools. So it's not that during the AT consideration guide, you have to be like, okay, I know exactly what I'm going to use with this student. You can't know that. We need to do some trials and figure those things out. So just know that this is kind of a starting point, and try not to get overwhelmed by looking at the entire form.
Then whose input do I get? Anyone can give input, but want to look at who works with the student, classroom teacher, be sure to get, even the Phy-Ed teacher. And then of course, the general ed teacher. And then they may need training or guidance, but let them know they can show up and just give input, and it's just a time for brainstorming. And then you can also get parents and students. With parents, I have invited them to the meeting before. Other times I've talked to them ahead of time over the phone and asked if they've had any concerns or assistive technology items they've thought of trialing for their child. And that can be brought up at that meeting too. So you don't have to have everybody at the meeting. I mean, it can be an interview or just a conversation before the meeting if they're not able to come.
Beautiful. And that ties in exactly to this. There's no way to say, okay, this is exactly how I need to get all the information that I need for the AT consideration. It can be a meeting, it can be a meeting where you and your entire team sit down, you've got the gen ed teacher, the parent, the student, the whole team. That can happen, whether in person, it can be a virtual meeting also. I've had other teams where it's difficult to get everyone together at the same time, and so we'll share out a Google Doc. Most of those AT consideration guides that we just shared are digital versions, so you can share those out and just have everyone typing in their information on the same form so that you don't even have to be in the same room at the same time. There are some benefits to synchronous meetings, being there all at the same time so that you can ask questions and kind of piggyback on what other people have said. But we also know that people's time is precious. People's times are precious. And so getting things somehow, even if that means an asynchronous opportunity, is better than not getting that information. And exactly as Tina said, sometimes you might have separate meetings or separate times that you go through that form. Especially with parents or families, that can happen sometimes too. So it's not quite as overwhelming sometimes, especially when you've got the whole team involved. If you're looking at a bunch of different areas, but if you have any other ideas or thoughts about how you've gotten good input from teams, whether that's different teachers, school members, paraprofessionals, go ahead and throw those in the chat window. We'd love to be able to share those out too.
Another time would be like a child study meeting. If you're talking and a lot of those team members are there, that's a great time to ask and get input too. And then the next part is, how do I document this? Some questions are, who writes it up? Where do I write it up? So who writes it up? It's kind of really the role of the special ed teacher. Sometimes I do as the teacher for the physically impaired, just because it's more my area and I'm kind of the one that brings it up too, because otherwise it is forgotten about. So it can be anyone on the team that, the team decides to write it up too. It doesn't have to always be the special ed teacher. So that mainly falls on them because they're the case manager. And then where do we write it up? That is up to kind of the team, and it just has to be in there somewhere. So if you do decide on like a trial of like a switch or a communication device, that should go under the AT section of the IEP. And you can list like trialing a variety of switches, trialing a variety of apps, whatever you might be trialing. And then you trial that for 6 to 8 weeks. Then you can, I've come back and forth, Julie. I don't know. Sometimes people go back into the IEP and they might amend that AT section and talk to the parents and then put what they have chosen.
Yeah, that's what I usually recommend. It kind of depends. If you're going to have an IEP meeting in a couple weeks, it's like, okay, I'll hold off. Of course, you're going to hold
Yeah.
off and just do it at the IEP meeting. But if you've got quite a bit of time before that IEP happens again, then I would make sure that you're amending that so that in the off chance that that student goes somewhere else in the meantime, that information is clearly documented in that IEP.
Yep. And then just make sure any team member knows what AT is and how and where it needs to be documented. Just, I know sometimes I put out, we need to have an AT meeting or a set meeting, and I get emails, what is this? They're not sure. And then even assistive technology, instead of using abbreviations so that people understand that more. Then right into the IEP, the trials. And then if the team considers AT and it decides it's not needed, document that too. And I know through the Northern Lights Special Ed Co-op, we have drop downs in the AT area where you can go to the little arrow and it'll drop down canned statements. So then you could just put that statement in. That is one of them. But just to know that it was at least considered. Because it seems like we're missing a lot of those EBD, LD students that might be benefits for with some AT devices or apps or different pens to help, C pens to help them read and be more successful in their classrooms.
Great. And then these actually, I'll talk about this slide because it's my turn to talk on this slide. But Tina actually is the one who shared out these examples. There's an example of a set write up, and I will just bring that up on the screen for just a second. And just know that you can link into that and see what that looks like. And you can see she's got it set up by the set, the student, the environment, and the tasks and the tools outlined there. Excuse me. And
And
then
it's
also,
just an example, just a summary, just to identify kind of their increase their goals, look at that.
this initial set write up too. Oops, I think this is the one. Also written up similarly, again with the tasks and tools. Maybe that was a different one. Here we go. But I just want to bring your attention to, these are not like 6-page write-ups, it's like a couple paragraphs. And so just keep in mind that even for an evaluation, it doesn't need to be a super in-depth write-up. You just need to make sure that you're addressing those 4 elements that you've, if that's how you've written it in the eval, even the student, the environment, the tasks, and the tools.
And then sometimes if I've already done an initial one, the next time there's an eval, I just do a review. If I'm on the case or with the student, just review because some things change. Sometimes we're not using that anymore. We've changed to a different technology. So just updating that is nice after the 3 years too.
Great.
And to see if there's something new we need to trial. And then the next slide is just some tools. The first one is an example of a tool sheet that we've made up at the Northern Lights Special Ed Co-op. And we just has updated it so it looked more friendly, visually friendly, and plus took out a lot of the old technology that was on the list that we don't use anymore, like Alpha Smarts, just some different things that the technology has gotten better. And then there's just different areas and then what technology may help them in that area. It's a really good resource.
Yeah, and the next link on there is just a very similar write-up. It's just the one that we have in Duluth Public Schools, and it's very similar, not as pretty color-wise, but written up by, still again by category. What are some things that you might want to consider for reading, for math? By all the different areas that we look at, kind of general functioning when we're considering the SET framework. So just know that those are 2 places where you can start when you're thinking about the tools portion of the AT consideration guide. So again, just a couple more resource sources for you there in your tool belt. That is all that Tina and I wanted to bring here today to you, mostly because we wanted to make sure that we were saving a lot of time for questions and answers, because we know that a lot of the questions that come up are really great questions when you're doing AT consideration. And so if you want to, I'm going to stop screen sharing here because we don't need to see that Q&A on the board. But if you want to unmute yourself and ask any questions or share anything that you've done or had success with in the AT consideration process, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to put anything in the chat window, whatever you'd like.
I don't know if anyone else has had a team where they've done assistive technology and who started it. If anybody wants to share.
Or
Because
here's another
usually,
conversation
sorry.
starter too. Yeah, go ahead, Tina.
I think usually I feel like it's just me on the team, which I'm working on trying to get someone else to start it up in those different districts. Otherwise, it's forgotten about. So if I'm on the team, then we make sure it's addressed. Or even another team member will say, "Oh, Tina's here. Oh, remember this, Tina?" They'll remind me. So I think it's nicer if we can get someone that's consistent with those caseloads in that district or school.
Tina, that was kind of my question, so I'm an OT for those of you who don't know me, but we were doing an IEP meeting for an LD student, and AT I think just wasn't really considered, and so I had brought that up to the SPED teacher beforehand. Should the team be considering AT for this student? So I was thinking along the lines of a CPEN reader or speech to text, and I just didn't really get any buy-in on that, and I wasn't really sure how else I could proceed with that. I didn't know if, I should still be doing, if I could trial AT still, or how that should be documented. And if I'm the only one kind of wanting to consider it, I wasn't really sure my role, basically.
And I think that happens a lot. And so I guess what I would encourage is to say, we need to consider it on every IEP, no matter what disability. And then you could say, let's just, even if it's just the two of you, talk about what kind of things you wanted to trial. And if you needed to get more of a team, you could do that. But even if the two of you talk and say, I have this idea to try the CPEN reader, what do you think about it? And I mean, that can be as simple as considering it. It doesn't have to be a formal meeting or sheet.
Yeah.
So does something have to be put in the IEP that, like either under accommodations that AT will be trialed, or in the service page under AT, or what would that look like?
Yeah, Ashley, that's a great question. I was just going to jump in. Yes, so it is best practice to document either in the accommodations or in the assistive technology section. In Duluth, we say in the AT section, but different districts and regions or in the region do it differently. But it has to be somewhere. Documenting that you will do trials, and usually what we write is what they will be trialed for. So the purpose or the task that it's going to be trialed for. So for example, the student will trial assistive technology to support communication if they're going to be looking at AAC devices. Or in your situation, they'll be trialing assistive technology to support reading or writing. And so that's, you could write it in that globally. And then what happens is that gives you time to consider over the course of that IEP, different AT tools, which then allows you to, I don't want to say convince, but to have a conversation with the case manager or the person that's not really, that you're not getting buy-in yet from, that yes, you might have to take the lead on those trials. But a lot of times what I've seen is that once a person who doesn't initially have buy-in sees some of that data about the independence that a tool can lend to a student, then they're like, oh, okay, now I get it. They can sit and listen to that book and then answer all the questions about it. I don't have to sit there and for 2 hours read them their science textbook. So sometimes just doing those trials can be really powerful to get the buy-in, and writing that into the IEP opens that door. Does that make sense, Ashley?
Yeah. Another question on that. Does it have to be, you had said, like 6 to 8 weeks of trialing. If I'm seeing the student every other week, how consistent if the case manager isn't also trialing and carrying that over, what does that look like then if, well, you're only doing it, a few times over that 6 to 8 week period?
So that's why I think you have to make sure that the team is willing to trial it, so that the case manager trials it, or the special ed teacher, and then you do. So it is a weekly thing that they're trialing.
Yeah. And I was pretty much told, if you want to trial it, go ahead and let me know if anything's successful.
Yeah. And go ahead, Tina.
Would you recommend, I guess I would go maybe to the administrator, or if you have a special ed coordinator, I would go to that.
Okay. Thank you.
That's where I would. What do you think, Julie? I mean,
yeah, I do. I really think too, if you can do those trials, like really pick what you think your most powerful tool is going to be, really that thing that might give you the most bang for your buck, so to speak, that might show the biggest impact the most quickly. Because sometimes getting people on board to collect data can be really a big chore. Ashley, what you are reporting is not, you are not the only person in these shoes. So just know that that is the case, unfortunately. And so sometimes, again, being able to show like some really quick data surrounding that can be helpful. Also, I mean, in our district in Duluth Public Schools, that 6 to 8 week guideline is simply a guideline. And that if trials are going more slowly and data is a little more difficult to collect at times, we have we have extended that, like maybe it's a 3-month trial, maybe it goes on even longer than that. But of course, as you know, sometimes it's hard to get any progress showing if you're only getting a data point or a trial every 2 weeks. But yeah, so I would try to lean into those things that you think might show some really strong, powerful data really quickly. It's a tough situation, and I'm not sure that there's like a magic answer to that.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah. What other questions about situations that you've had considering assistive technology, or if you have a student coming up that you're going to start doing that with, and you're like, I don't even know where to start? That's what we're here for, to answer any of those questions along any of the process in AT consideration. And I can go ahead and I'll stop recording now. Sounds like there may not be too many more questions out there, but we will make sure that we hang around.